BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Friday, another Cooper Friday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Fridays, I talk to you guys about DB Cooper, the man responsible for the only unsolved skyjacking in U.S. aviation history. And in this episode, I have the pleasure of being joined by John Limbach. He is the author of the book Where Was Skip? And he's going to be talking to us all about his DB Cooper suspect, Skip Hall. John, are you with me?
I am with you, Ned. It's great to be with you in the Black Box Battalion. I love the show and really excited to spend this time with you.
Yes, and thanks for appearing on Cooper Friday. So, if I could ask you to take us back years ago, when did you first learn about DB Cooper?
So, I was born in 1966, just to date myself right out of the box on Black Box, and I have recollections of going back and talking to my father about the DB Cooper hijacking. That Thanksgiving, my grandparents were talking about it at the Thanksgiving table, so I have a real light recollection of that. But the next thing that I could recall was the In Search of episode with that was done with Leonard Nimoy, who I knew as Mr. Spock on Star Trek going up as a kid, and watching that, and really going from there. The Unsolved Mysteries episode. I've always kind of loved true crime, even before I knew it was called true crime. And then I remember, I think it was Jeffrey Gray's book was the next time I got back into the case. I was reading his book, and I was really intrigued about Kenny Christensen and what happened there. And then it kind of fell off the radar for me until, very strangely, I, during the pandemic, got into trying to figure out what happened with the Forrest Fenn treasure hunt. And there were some people in the Forrest Fenn community that were thinking, was Forrest Fenn DB Cooper? And a couple of people even wrote a book about it. And because I was looking into the treasure hunt, it sparked my interest again into the DB Cooper case. And lo and behold, in 2023, doing some research, I found out about this guy named Lauren Hall, and it kind of started as a joke because it was at the same time that my friends Ryan Burns, Chris Broer, and Nikki Broughton were really seriously looking into Milton Vordahl. And I was doing some research into Vordahl, trying to help out if I could. But at the same time, I was finding out little bits and pieces about Lauren Hall, and I would send it to them almost as a joke, which I'm sure was a big groaner from them because they were so into looking into Milton Vordahl at the time. But it just started to snowball from there with Hall. And, a couple of notes became pages, and pages started to turn into a chapter. And if you would have asked me at the beginning of 2023, would I be publishing a book in 2024, I would have said you were crazy. But as often happens in our world, here we are talking, less than 2 years later, and the book has now been out for over a year, and I've been really surprised and thankful and humbled and have a lot of gratitude to the feedback I've gotten since the book came out.
John, you said something really good right there, and that is that you were a true crime follower, but you didn't know that it was true crime at the time. And that's the way that I felt growing up, because I often tell people on Black Box Online Radio, I've been following true crime programs for 30 years, but I didn't know that. I just thought it was like living normal life and just watching TV, and this, is just what was on the TV on Friday night and Saturday night. Granted, no one else that I knew was watching that type of stuff, and I was kind of just sitting by myself, cut off from civilization, which was very predictive of the future. But I've come to terms with it. And at the same time, though, for you watched the show from In Search of, and then you watched Unsolved Mysteries. But those programs were about 10 years apart, right? I mean, one was in the 70s
Right.
and one was in the 80s, right?
That's correct. Yes. Yeah.
And did you have, like... Go ahead.
Yeah, to your point, Ned, I think, we didn't call it true crime, but it seems most of us were the kids that were really looking into what happened to Amelia Earhart, what happened to Jimmy Hoffa. And so I think there's kind of a DNA of true crime before it was true crime, that everybody has those kind of touch points of cases certainly you with the Zodiac and other things like that. But I remember being really into what happened to Amelia Earhart when I was a little kid, and I remember, obviously what happened to Jimmy Hoffa. Those were things that for some reason I had interest in, and it seems as more of us get to know each other in the true crime area, depending upon our age, we all kind of had those proclivities as we were growing up.
So you really followed the disappearance of Amelia Earhart, and now you have written a book about DB Cooper. Do you think that you have some strong leanings toward aviation, or is it just because of the unsolved mystery aspect?
I think it's more the unsolved mystery aspect. I certainly am enthralled by aviation, and I love to fly, and certainly have appreciated learning more about it because of the Cooper case. But even with the Earhart case, it was more about what happened to her than the aviation side of it. So I would have to say that this case has really brought me into aviation education. It wasn't like that until the DB Cooper case.
And I would really like to ask you about that because I was talking to Pat Boland recently. She was my first ever guest on Cooper Friday, and we both had a similar experience where we didn't really do a lot with aviation prior to DB Cooper. And I think anybody who gets under the surface in the vortex is just going to be kind of blown away by how much you'll be exposed to aviation, learning details about airplanes, details about parachutes, and as I even point out with the book The Skyjacker, which I follow closely from Dr. David G. Hubbard, the psychological profiling of skyjackers is completely different than other true crime psychology. So, what has your experience been like learning about aviation?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think what pulls you in, if you haven't, and like you talked about Pat, who I'm friends with, I just spent almost an hour with her on the phone last week talking about some other things related to the case. And I think what pulls you in is, as you think about the DB Cooper hijacking, there's aspects to it that truly are a bank robbery in the air. And so as you're thinking about a bank robbery, you're thinking about what's the plan for the location, what's the getaway plan, do you need an accomplice or not, how are you going to get away? So as you're pulled into the vortex for the Cooper case, part of it is how did he get away with it? And to do that, you have to start looking into, what would he do at the airport? How would you get onto the plane without someone knowing? How would you pull off a hijacking? How would you specifically parachute out of the back of a 727. So you're starting to learn about commercial aircraft that actually had an aft stairway. So you're learning about that. You're learning about, what speed, you would want to be at to safely parachute, what altitude you'd want to be at to parachute. Where would you want to land? You wouldn't want to land into a place where you wouldn't want to land in the ocean. You wouldn't want to land in an inhospitable area that would be difficult for you to get out of, have an awful landing. So just, I think, from a stream of consciousness of taking a bank robbery on the ground into the air, that's how you get drawn into it. And then it's just so fascinating when you start to learn more and more about, the ways that Cooper could, how would Cooper get caught? So the thought process is if he truly was not able to put down the aft stairs on that aircraft, he literally is now in a jail cell up in the sky, right? He's either going to be taken in when he's in Portland, in Seattle, or when they would land in Reno or whatever that destination would be if he truly could not get out of the aircraft. So when you start thinking about all of those different aspects about aviation, you just keep digging in more and more and more. What did the pilots experience? What's the difference between the pilot and Bill Radachek versus Captain Scott versus Harold Anderson, who's the flight engineer? The three stations for the front station and the rear station for the three flight attendants. The layout, the seating arrangement, why Cooper sat in the back row, and it just keeps going on and on and on. And then, when did he jump out? What time did he jump out? On what part of the flight path of Victor 23? Did he deploy immediately? If he did, he would travel further with the wind away from where he actually left the aircraft. Would he wait a while to pull the ripcord and be dropping further straight down so that you start to look at what would the landing areas be, which starts, as you know, all the way from Ariel and Lake Merwin all the way down to the Columbia River. Some people still believe he deployed after the Columbia River. So then learning more and more about the 727 because of the terminology and the lingo that the flight crew used and that Cooper used. What was his level of knowledge of the 727? So you dig more into that. Who would have had the knowledge that Cooper had? Was he a smoke jumper? Was he, in the military? Was he Air America? Was he Mac v. SOG? Who would DB Cooper be to have the knowledge that he had, or that we assume he had, based on the transcripts and the FBI 302? So it truly is a vortex, as you said, Nick, because you can keep diving in more and more. But one of the great things, as you mentioned with your conversations with Pat, is it's a wonderful education into something that you never really thought you would do it in your life before getting involved in the Cooper case. And it's fascinating, and I think those that enjoy the DB Cooper case enjoy all the fascinating aspects to it, including more about aviation.
Oh, absolutely, though. But you brought up some very good things, and I do want to talk to you a lot about Skip Hall and your book. But there's a subject that we're on now that I think needs a little bit more attention, and that's Cooper's understanding of the Boeing 727. Because now, as you just said, it seems to me that D.B. Cooper knew a lot about the Boeing 727. He knew a lot about the features of the plane. He knew a lot about airplanes in general. But at the same time, D.B. Cooper did not know how to lower the aft staircase, correct? So, what exactly is going on? And how exactly do you think this relates to your suspect? I mean, do you think that he was just somebody who was very familiar with airplanes, but he didn't know everything? Or do you think that there's a different motivation going on? What do you think about that?
Well, I certainly have my opinions that I'll share with you. For me to say I know, I don't think any of us know, and I think it starts with the fact that we're reading from FBI 302s, which means that somebody took notes and then had their notes typed up. And as you know, there weren't actual voice recordings of those interviews at the time where we could hear what was actually being said to the FBI agents who were taking down those notes. So we assume from the disparate information we have from two different sources that Cooper either said that the stairs could be deployed from the cockpit, which would be erroneous, as you intimated, for the 727. They could only be released from the rear of the aircraft. There was not a mechanism in the cockpit. There certainly was a light indicator for the pilot and the flight engineer and the first officer to know that the stairs were deployed, but they could not deploy them themselves. So I think when we assume that Cooper said they can do it from the cockpit, if we believe that's what he said, then he was incorrect. If for some reason it was lost in translation with the way it was recorded in the FBI 302s, he might have said that. But what buttresses Cooper not knowing is him needing to have Tina Mucklow demonstrate to him how the stairs would be put down. Because originally he was going to keep her on the aircraft to do it. In fact, there was discussion of her actually being tied up with some shroud lines from the parachute that he had used shroud lines to do the drag bag for the money, canvas money bag, that he potentially would be tying them to Tina Mucklow so she wouldn't get sucked out of the aircraft. As you know, Cooper finally sent her into the cabin in front of the aircraft, said he would do it himself, and he in fact figured it out. But that, to your point, goes to he knew enough about the 727 to talk about the flaps being at 15 degrees, the airspeed, the gear down. He knew to call the interphone as opposed to intercom, PA. He directed, I believe, Alice Hancock to go back to her station. Station is a word. That's exactly what it's called in the Boeing training manual. So he got enough right for the pilots to think and the crew to think that he had some knowledge. And he certainly had knowledge about talking about we believe that he said when it came to the flight plan that they could pick it up in the air. And if he's using that terminology, that's a terminology used for IFR, instrument flight rating for commercial aircraft. Someone would need to know that you could actually take off and be getting that in the air as opposed to waiting and having to have it on the ground before you would taxi and take off. So Cooper certainly had some level of aviation knowledge that he either studied up on real well or that he experienced. But at the same time, my opinion is that he did not know how to deploy the stairs. It was the first time that he did it. And if he did say that they could lower it from the cockpit, he was wrong on that note. And so again, is Larry Carr, the FBI agent who handled the case from 2007 to 2010, has said, Cooper knew just enough to be dangerous, but thought he probably knew a lot that he didn't know. And as Larry has elocuted that profile and his beliefs about DB Cooper, I tend to agree with Larry on just about everything except the fact that Larry believes that DB Cooper perished the night of the hijacking, and I certainly believe that DB Cooper survives that jump.
And I do also believe that DB Cooper survived. But one thing that I like to discuss on Cooper Friday is there's a lot of YouTube content out there about DB Cooper. And some of the examples that I bring up from time to time come to us from Pat Brown, the psychological profiler, as well as Simon Whistler, who makes countless YouTube videos. And when these absolute newcomers to the DB Cooper case just took a first glance at this, they said some things that you just touched upon right there. They're like, this guy Cooper, it seems like he is very, very familiar with Boeing. And like as you just said about reciting, verbiage from the Boeing manual, but they didn't really think that he was a military guy. They thought more like he was a Boeing engineer or just some type of disgruntled Boeing employee, but they didn't see any evidence of a military background. And what would you say to something like that?
Yeah, I think a couple things. People that are skydivers, Mark Metzler, who's a legal expert and skydiving expert, who is, very revered in the Cooper community, and we're very thankful to have him be a supporter and a participant in the Cooper conference every year. Says a skydiver probably would have brought his own rig on. The other copycats did. And the fact that for whatever reason, instead of demanding that the knapsack be brought on board for the money so that it could be tied in a different way, Cooper just took that canvas money bag. We jokingly call it like a Looney Tunes bag, if you remember from the cartoons, where it did not have any ties on it. It was basically just a canvas bank bag that held that over 20 pounds of $20 bricks of money in it that he literally cut up shroud lines and tied to, but did so, we believe, as one would do a drag bag in survival training, parachuting, military parachuting. So the fact that he was asking for back parachutes and front parachutes, and the fact of the drag bag would lead me more to believe not that he was a halo jumper or a smoke jumper or a Mac VSOC, which he very certainly could be. And as you may know, I'm good friends with Drew Beeson, and certainly excited about him and Tim Wallace and D-Rog starting their new podcast on Ted Braden. I believe it's going to be called You Should Not Know This, and they're recording their first episode right now. But I would lean to some type of Goldilocks person who, just based on age, Ned, of Cooper being likely in his 40s, would have served in some capacity in the military unless he had a deferment or was in some type of position where he did not need to serve in the military. He would have had military experience at that age. And I believe it's got to be someone who at a minimum had some type of survival skill training. I can't believe it would be their first jump, but every time I say something like that, I think of our friend Martin McNally, the Cooper copycat, who's actually going to be at our conference again this year. And Mac had never jumped from a plane, jumps out of a 727 within a year after DB Cooper, going over, I believe, 300 miles an hour. I think he set the record for a commercial jump because most people would die, or, he had a very good chance of dying. Only jumped with a front parachute, a reserve parachute, with $500,000. He lost the money, obviously, but he survived that jump. And so it kind of just messes everything up. We were like, well, here's a guy who had never even done it before, and he pulled it off. So, while there's certain things specific to the Cooper case on the drag bag, the tying of the money bag, kind of MacGyvering that part of it. And I think most people conclude that he probably knew he was going to get some type of military parachute in the fact that he was so close to Fort Lewis at the time, Joint Base Lewis McChord, that he might have thought that the parachutes, front and back parachutes that they brought would either be coming from a jump center, like the Issaquah Jump Center or Joint Base Lewis McChord. But again, we just don't know, so we're utilizing our best guesses to try to figure it out.
Now, you just brought up McNally, and if I recall correctly, when he made his jump, though, he was actually knocked unconscious, and I would be citing Ryan Burns, of course, and everything that he does over on DB Cooper
Yes.
Sleuth, wonderful channel. But, like, so he jumps out, and he is actually knocked unconscious either because of the speed or just the conditions, and then he was able to regain consciousness and then successfully do the jump to a certain extent. But that to me sounds like he got lucky, more or less. I don't know what you would think about that.
Oh, I totally agree with you. I mean, just the airspeed alone, it's insane that he survived. No one even, we had Mike Davis, paratrooper of the year for the Army, at the conference on stage last year with Lee Gossett from, Air America, and then Mark Metzler, skydiving expert. So we had a paratrooper of the year, we had a smoke jumper, and a skydiving expert on the stage, and they all just shook their head and said, that's a no-go for anyone. And also, McNally had to have a member of the cockpit come back and show him how to put it on, because they only brought reserve chutes on for him. So he did not have a primary parachute when he jumped. And because the parachute was in front of him when he deployed it, the canopy basically, exploded out into his face, as you said, bruised his face badly, which was interesting because he ended up being in the same hotel that many of the FBI agents stayed in with his bruised face. And not only exactly how you described it, but once he landed, because he had been concussed, I believe he fell asleep for like 13 hours and slept by a tree after the hijacking. So it really is amazing, number one, that he survived. Number two, that he's still alive, and we're going to have him back with his own version of Tina Mucklow. Sharon Madayow is going to be at the conference as well, too, and she was a flight attendant, and you might think she would dislike Martin very highly for hijacking their plane, but over the years they become friends, and she was in the podcast American Skyjacker that went to number 3 on True Crime for Apple, and we new announcement here, if you're unaware of it, we are going to be doing a premiere of the new movie American Skyjacker, full feature documentary. It'll be released on Amazon at the end of this year. It's going to have a limited theater release, and one of the premiere showings is going to be the Saturday night, November 15th of the CooperCon weekend.
Oh, that's amazing, and we're definitely going to be looking out for that. Yes, and I've listened to some of the American Skyjacker. It is a great podcast, but I've been watching the little preview things about the documentary. That'd be so great to see that in a theater, and some
Right.
stuff to look forward to. But John, we've been talking a lot about all things Cooper, all things aviation, but at this point, I would like to get to your particular suspect. And if you'd like to share with us, who was Skip Hall?
Yeah, like you said, there's a vast amount of information that I've now amassed on Skip Hall, 267 pages in the book that I published last year. And I think probably the easiest way to start off with is just give you a quick 2-minute bio of him and then just kind of go through a checklist. So Skip Hall was born in 1930 in a little town called Newton, Kansas, which is about 20 miles north of Wichita. So when we think about throwing a dartboard at the United States map, the bullseye would be Kansas. So when DB Cooper is described as having a Midwest or no accent, Lauren Hall starts off right there. And, usually for a Cooper suspect, you want to say, well, let's start with the basics. Let's take a look at the sketches. Does the person match? And then what is their physical profile? And Lauren Hall is again a Goldilocks in the DB Cooper lexicon for that. His height is exact, 5'10" to 6 feet. His 2 separations from the United States Army have him listed at 5'10" and a half, 5'11". He's described also as 6 feet in Department of Justice documents, and so he self-described himself as 5'11" as well too. His weight. DB Cooper's weight, 175 to 195. That's a bullseye again for Lauren Hall, exact weight. Eye color of DB Cooper, brown or hazel, exact match to Lauren Hall. He had brown eyes. Hair, black, that's an exact match. And not only that, but some of the new information I have on Hall, I had about 20 photos of Lauren Hall, Ned, when I wrote the book. I now have over double that, and including some video of Lauren Hall. And of course, you probably heard some of the voice recordings that Ryan has put, as you mentioned, on the DB Cooper Sleuth channel. But not only did Lauren Hall have black hair, but as it would grow out, it would marcel. And actually, when it got even longer in the mid-1970s, it would actually these large curls would almost afro out. And so Lauren Hall also had a receding hairline. And depending upon what height he was at when you were looking at him, if you were looking at him seated and you were above him, he would look almost like he had, one witness described, kind of Nixon hair at the top and the front. If you were looking at him straight on, he would look like the Bing sketch. And if he was a little bit above you, his hair would look like that in the Cary Grant sketch. So that was an exact match. DB Cooper's complexion was described as olive ruddy. Lauren Hall was described as dark-complected, olive, swarthy, Mexican appearing, and some people believed he was Cuban because he had spent time in Cuba, which we can certainly talk about if we have time. And he could pass for being of Latin descent. So as you know, that's a match to Cooper. Based on his age, I said he was born in 1910. He would have been approximately 42 years of age at the time of the hijacking. Interestingly enough, going back to reports about Hall when he was 30 years old, people would describe him between 5 to 12 years older than he looked, and that's a consistent thing. Even Jim Garrison, when he was brought Hall to New Orleans, or Hall went voluntarily finally after being subpoenaed and winning, not having to be extradited from California to meet with the New Orleans district attorney who was going to be trying Clay Shaw in the conspiracy for the Kennedy assassination. He thought Lauren Hall was 47 at the time that Lauren Hall was 37. So when people describe Hall as DB Cooper as, having the turkey neck, maybe wrinkly upper lip, those types of things, Hall fits right in, not only from age, but also, the potential documentation that we have on him. We know that he had a deep voice. As I mentioned, we've heard his recording, the same about his accent. And Lauren Hall is one of the only Cooper suspects that I'm aware of that we actually have photos of him wearing a clip-on ties with a white clasp. So for those of your listeners that don't know, the JCPenney Towncraft 3 snapper tie was a specific type of clip-on tie that had an adjustable knot and apparatus on it. And they specifically made the metal piece that would go over the collar white because a lot of clip-on ties, and I had clip-on ties when I was a little kid, would just be kind of bare metal. But you could see that clasp as it went over a white collar. And so they took that to the next level. And, of course, the tie that DB Cooper wore had that white clasp on it. So Hall is one of the only suspects we know that obviously had a proclivity to wear clip-on ties because we have multiple photos of him wearing clip-on ties. And we have a specific photo of him wearing a clip-on tie with a white clasp going over the collar on it. He was a smoker. Of the 40 photos I have of him, Ned, at least 50% of them have him holding a cigarette in his hand, and a few have him with one has a cigar in his mouth and a cigarette in his mouth. He was, by all accounts, according to his stepson, his son, his grandchildren, daughter-in-law, he was what you would call a chain smoker, and only really slowed down in his last couple of years when he was battling cancer before he died at age 65 in 1995. What I was surprised to learn from his son, his only biological son left from his first marriage, I wrote in the book that he had 4 children from his first marriage. I actually found out that they had 5, and that they had given their 5th child, a son, up for adoption because they were so poor at the time. The pregnancy in 1956, that 5th son, Robert, being born in 1957, that they had given that son up for adoption to a wealthier family in Newton. And that's the same time that Lauren Hall spent 2 months in a VA hospital for a nervous breakdown and was treated with Thorazine at that time. So he obviously had some mental issues as well, too. But his son, Larry, who sat across from me from an Applebee's in Newton, Kansas last year, at this time in August, I was asking about cigarettes, and Larry, who had not read my book yet, talked about his father smoking Raleigh cigarettes when they were little. And of course, my eyes got really wide, and his daughter, who I'm now friends with, and built that relationship before I got a chance to meet with Larry. Her name is Christy Hall. Christy looked at me because she had read the book and knew that DB Cooper had smoked Raleigh cigarettes. She had only remembered him smoking Chesterfields and other brands. And Larry's eyes got big when he realized, yes, when Dad came back to Kansas in 1977, before he had to go testify to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, he was compelled to go testify and was then later granted immunity for his testimony to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. He was no longer smoking Raleigh cigarettes. So that's a very interesting thing that I learned, after the book was published and was able to share at CooperCon last year, and we'll update this year. I also now have photos of Loran Hall from 1969, 68, 69, 1971 that I did not have when I published the book. And in one of those photos, Ned, he is wearing a brown russet suit jacket with a thin black tie, and he's wearing slip-on brown shoes. So that is a really stunning photograph that I'll be sharing at CooperCon in November for the first time. And, we know that DB Cooper was described as wearing a brown russet-colored suit, and that he was wearing brown pebble-grained, no-lace shoes. So showing that photograph in November, I think, will at least get people talking about, Loran Hall having a proclivity to dress similarly to DB Cooper. So Hall could easily pull off an executive appearance, but at the same time, he only rose to mid-level management, and if we have time, we can certainly talk about that. But getting back to his appearance, there is a family trait of turkey neck in the Hall family, and I have photos with Larry Hall, who I met, and of Larry, who's his son, who bears a striking resemblance to Skip, except for the fact that he has his mother's blue eyes, but he still had the black hair that's now gray, obviously, because Larry's in his 70s. But the turkey neck, and I have pictures of Skip with that feature, and that famously comes from passenger Bill Mitchell, who sat across from Cooper, saying that he remembered him having a sagging chin, or what Bill described as a turkey neck. So I guess I'll take a break there, and that's just the physical appearance side before maybe we get into talking about Skip Hall's, military experience and vocations that he had. But I kind of wanted to stop there just to see if you had any questions or anything about some of the things I mentioned about Hall's appearance.
Absolutely, because first I have a comment, then a question. The comment is mostly for the listeners of Cooper Friday here, and if you want to follow along with DB Cooper discussions, you can hit the like button and subscribe. Every Friday I put out an episode about DB Cooper, also talking about the Zodiac Killer on Mondays, John Benet Ramsey on Tuesdays, Jack the Ripper on Wednesdays, and the Black Dahlia on Thursdays. Lots of things here on Black Box Online Radio. But in terms of the sketches, it might seem like the most elementary example of an investigation. Like, that's the first thing that people are going to do, compare a suspect to the sketch. Anybody can do it. It's not like some giant forensic innovation. But I really noticed that about Skip Hall when I first, compared him to the sketches. It was exactly what you said. He resembles multiple sketches. And almost like if you were to take composites A, B, and C and put them all together, you would have somebody that looked like Skip Hall. So I give you full credit for that. Now, the question for you is, if Skip Hall were a chain smoker, why didn't DB Cooper smoke more when he was on the plane? Because DB Cooper only used 8 cigarettes, right? But he only smoked 7. He gave 1 to Tina Mucklow, and he smoked 7 cigarettes during this entire operation. That doesn't sound like a lot for a chain smoker, now does it?
Well, I would say this. First of all, I guess my definition of chain smoker, I'll start off, was this was described to me as a 2-pack-a-day habit, and not being a smoker, I don't know, how many cigarettes per hour that is during, based on your waking time. But as we look at, Dan Cooper and how long he lived, we have to assume that he probably, crushed a heater before he went up to Dennis Lisney at the ticket counter, and then boarded the flight and obviously immediately lit up. That flight from Portland to Seattle, gate to gate, was supposed to be about a half an hour. And prior to the passengers deplaning when things were being brought on is the majority of the time that Cooper smoked those cigarettes. So that would have been in those first 3 hours. Afterwards, Cooper is rigging the money bag. He's, putting on the parachutes. He's doing all those things. So I think those last 2 hours from Seattle to potentially the time he deplanes, I don't know when there would have been an appropriate time for him to light up, because he's working hard on his mission at that time. But it's a very great question, Ned, and I'm just not enough of an expert as a smoker to try to, put numbers to chain smoking, except to say that it seems like a lot to me that someone would smoke 7 cigarettes even in 5 hours, let alone 3 hours. And I don't know what the true amount of available time on 305, he would have had versus the time that he's going to the bathroom. We know he spent a little bit of time in the bathroom. We know that he had to prepare the money bag. We know that he obviously had to get the chutes on. He had to deploy the stairs and do all of that. And how much of that encompassed that 5+ hours that Dan Cooper existed.
Well, yes, though, like, I'm not an expert on chain smoking either. Now, in terms of 2 packs a day, that really isn't that much. It's reported that the president, FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, smoked 3.5 packs a day. My grandfather smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day, died from lung cancer. People, these things will kill you. It's not just, an FDA joke. They will kill you. But for DB Cooper, it really is kind of hard to judge because he's clearly smoking cigarettes. Some people think he put on a ruse. Other people think that that was just him. And it sounds like with somebody like Skip, he was a smoker, and he did it because it's what he normally did, but he just didn't overdo it. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, again, I defer to you on your, knowing about FDR and your family history with it. 2 packs of cigarettes sounded like a lot to me, but maybe that makes even more sense that a 2-pack a day habit would equate to 7 cigarettes during the time period that he's preparing to jump.
Yeah, like a lot, but not like a lot, if we can be very clear.
Right.
But, I think at this point, though, I want to shift the conversation. However, there's one final follow-up about all things Cooper related. Now, you have this book out, Where Was Skip? And you've been telling me all of these really strong points about why Skip Hall could have been DB Cooper. But at what percentage would you say of certainty that you have identified DB Cooper? Like, are you absolutely sold 100% this was the guy? Or do you think that there's room for clarity?
Oh, I guess I'm a little bit of an oddball in the Cooper community because I'm at 0%, and my
Excuse me,
threshold
what?
for my threshold for even saying anyone is DB Cooper, I just don't feel comfortable, uttering those words about anybody unless, to me, there would be proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And since we don't have direct evidence, of anybody being at PDX, being on 305, fingerprint matching, obviously the lack of DNA, or what we have, a partial DNA. I certainly feel very good about Skip Hall being considered DB Cooper, and that I've done it in a way that I followed in, as I stated in the book, Drew Beeson's footsteps with Ted Braden, to do it in a respectful way. I'm a little bit lucky, Ned, in the fact that you're talking about a guy that had already been accused of potentially being involved in the assassination of a president, and was actually 3 of his adult children were convicted and did prison time at the end of the 1980s for him running a meth lab during Iran-Contra. So there wasn't a real big stigma attached to, potentially an accusation that he might have hijacked an aircraft where, nobody was injured, besides the mental duress that people went through, obviously, that we talk about. But, that almost seems like, his shoplifting charge in 1961, when you think of the other things that Skip Hall was associated with. But let me also say, my goal is not to be coy about it. It's very strange that there aren't a lot of things that I thought I might uncover that would exclude Hall, where I could, because the last thing any of us want to do is be so wrapped into confirmation bias that we only see what we want to see, and we don't take into consideration the things that lead away from our person being, potentially DB Cooper. But I know that it's very odd. I know people use the word suspect peddler in the Cooper world for people that have written books about a Cooper suspect and they peddle the suspect. I like to say I'm a book peddler because I wrote a book and I'm selling it, so I am definitely peddling a book. But I am only asking people to consider what the factual information that I'm finding about Skip Hall. And I have not yet, nor will I ever make the statement, and I'm not even going to say it here where someone could snip it out of your interview with me about him and DB Cooper, unless I had 100% concrete belief. I believe he will go down as probably having the most circumstantial evidence. I know that was once said about Ted Braden, and Drew's done a fantastic job, and now with the podcast they're doing. But I think, especially with my follow-up to the first book and the information I continue to find, and even new information that was just coming in last week, that Skip Hall will eventually be seen as certainly a top-tier suspect with the most circumstantial evidence leading one to believe that he might have been DB Cooper. So sorry to dance around that, but I just, my statement is that I think the bar for me is so high. I kind of use the Larry Carr standard that unless there's concrete evidence that someone was there and could have done the crime, I'm just not ready to make that leap to state that anybody is DB Cooper.
Okay, but I don't think I can let you get away from that. And you, by your own admission, said that you were dancing around that. Now, you just said, though, that you have made a strong case for Skip being DB Cooper, but you also said that you are 0%. And did you really mean that you're 0% on the suspect rating? And what's going on?
Well, yeah, so I think I was very careful in the book to call him a person of interest because I didn't like the idea of non-law enforcement calling someone a suspect. And I say that, Ned, again, I'm very lucky in having Hall and the fact that he was involved in so many other things that were in his criminal behavior. But I think you're also aware of that there have been some families that have been very vocal about feeling harmed by people in the Cooper community that have said they've identified a suspect, and that suspect they believe is likely to be DB Cooper, and they've gone to the media and articles have been written, and then the Wikipedia page has been updated with their loved one on Wikipedia, when most of the experts in the Cooper community don't believe that person could be DB Cooper. And that may have shaped the way that I feel about this topic. Fortunately, I've befriended the Hall family. Unfortunately, the stepson that was really a huge part of the book passed away on November 15th, the same day that I was presenting at CooperCon. John Pappas passed away, but he was obviously hugely involved in supplying me with information. And some of the new photos that I had came from John just a few months before he passed away. So I feel an obligation to the Hall family to continue to put information out about Skip Hall potentially being DB Cooper. But do I believe he's a better suspect in the Cooper vernacular than pretty much all the other suspects? Certainly I do. I believe there's just a few that kind of meet that caliber, whether it's Ted Braden, Milton Vordahl. Ryan has a new suspect that he's going to be unveiling at CooperCon. He's talked with the family. The family may be participating at CooperCon with us, so there'll be another person there. But I definitely believe that Skip Hall, Ryan Burns has his own criteria, and Skip Hall is at the top of his chart right now for that. So I would say that of the suspects that are named for criteria of being Cooper, I would put Hall at the top.
So I think maybe the fairest way of putting it is you think that Lauren Skip Hall was a reasonable DB Cooper suspect, but you don't want to just put some type of number or percentage on it because that's not your responsibility. That's the responsibility of the authorities. Would you say that?
Well, I think that, and I think there's other things like predicting the outcome of a baseball game or sports prognostication. I'm the first one to say, man, I think the Brewers are going to win the World Series. I live in Milwaukee, in the Milwaukee area. They're the number one team in baseball right now.
It's true.
And I believe that they're going to win the World Series this year. Will they? Who knows? The Green Bay Packers, I'm a huge fan. So I have no problem putting percentages on those types of things. But as a business leader and when it comes to people's lives and families, I just don't like saying I put a percentage on this person being DB Cooper when the only evidence we have is circumstantial evidence.
Yes, I totally can follow you there, and I'm from West Virginia, so I really didn't watch the Brewers play a lot growing up, but they are having an amazing year. I was just watching them slaughter the Pittsburgh Pirates yesterday. Congrats to everybody in Milwaukee and the state of Wisconsin. And to be more focused, though, on DB Cooper, is there a connection between DB Cooper and the JFK assassination?
Boy, that's a really tough one. I mean, the only thing that if you take the angle, I know that I believe you did some work, and others have done work talking about E. Howard Hunt, which was a really fascinating. There's so many of these Cooper suspects that are just fascinating human beings outside of the whole D.B. Cooper thing. E. Howard Hunt certainly is. I love talking about him, and. I know that you looked into Najib Halabi being a former FAA president under Kennedy and then being in the Nixon White House the day of the Cooper hijacking. I've actually listened to that. You can actually listen to the recording of his interview with Nixon, and it sounds like there's infant chimpanzees banging pots and pans. The recording's so bad, but it's a really interesting listen. More interesting, though, is the fact that the transcript for that day in the White House talks about a meeting of men right before that, because the interview with Nixon and Halabi is pretty benign. Their conversation is pretty benign, but it's interesting that there's some times in the logs in the Nixon library of meetings that may have gone on before that. But getting back to specifically your question, the only connection between the JFK assassination and D.B. Cooper, if Lauren Hall is involved, is the fact that Lauren Hall, by no means of anything I've done except uncovering more information that proves that Hall was in Dallas, Texas, the day of the assassination, is if Lauren Hall was in fact D.B. Cooper, then there's certainly a connection between the Kennedy assassination and D.B. Cooper. But it's hard to believe that unless it's something that would be CIA related, that those two things would be tied together, because you're talking about November of 1963 to November of 1961, potentially, just like people in Watergate. Their names that were mentioned for the Kennedy assassination were involved in Watergate. We know Operation 40 or Traficante's S-Force or whatever you want to call them, those things. If there was some conspiracy involved with hijacking in the Cooper case, then that whole Hunt Sturgis group with the Cubans that were involved with Operation 40 potentially. I don't make that leap. The only leap I make, no pun intended, with D.B. Cooper is that Lauren Hall certainly and just factually would be considered involved in the Kennedy assassination. In the fact that he's mentioned in the Warren Commission report, he was investigated and subpoenaed by Jim Garrison, and he was compelled to testify to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. He was also put on the front page of papers across the country, including the National Enquirer, the National Tattler, and then the non-tabloid newspapers, as potentially being one of the men involved in the assassination of President Kennedy.
So what exactly was Skip Hall doing in Dallas on that day?
Well, that's a great question, and what I did in Where Was Skip, which was the title of my book, was ask the reader two questions. Obviously, where was he on November 24th, 1971, but do you believe that based on the evidence I presented in the book that he was in Dallas, Texas on that date? And because by November 23rd, the day after the president's assassination, and if you listen to the recordings of J. Edgar Hoover, with LBJ and so on and so forth, the FBI, Secret Service, they had their man. It was going to be Lee Harvey Oswald, and it was that he acted alone. Interestingly enough, many people that don't know the Lauren Hall story don't know that an FBI informant in Los Angeles named Sid Marks had actually been in the pawn shop investigative office where Lauren Hall and another soldier fortune named Jerry Hemming had put a Johnson 30-06 rifle with a scope that was supposedly used in the Bay of Pigs into pawn, number one, because Hemming couldn't travel with weapons because he had already been arrested for violations of the Neutrality Act, and it would have violated his probation. And number two, because they needed cash to travel back to Miami in Hall's car, with stops, by the way, in Dallas, Texas. Hall went back and retrieved that rifle on his own, paid the cash to get it out of hock, and Sid Marks happened to be in that pawn shop on that day. So literally on November 23rd, the FBI office in Los Angeles got a call to say a man named Roy Payne, who worked in that pawn shop investigative office, and Lauren Hall had a rifle with a scope on it that Lauren Hall took out of hock that day. And that's why the day after the assassination, the FBI was actually looking for Roy Payne, Lauren Hall. They found Roy Payne. They did not find Lauren Hall. And as you know from my book, Lauren Hall's stepson, John Pappas, is a first case witness with me saying, I lived with my mom and Skip. I know where I was. I know where my mom was. Skip Hall was not with us in California that day. Skip Hall also, Roy Payne and the other gentleman from that pawn shop did sworn affidavits, gave testimony that on November 18th, 1963, Lauren Hall visited them again. They had said, hey, we'd like you to come back and take part of an event with us tomorrow. And he said, I have to catch a plane to Dallas. They both swore to that and testified to that. Roy Payne, after he was approached by the FBI because of Sid Marks' comments on the 23rd, weeks after the assassination, Lauren Hall called Roy Payne. Roy Payne said, hey, buddy, you're in trouble, and Lauren Hall basically confessed to Roy Payne on that fall, per Roy Payne's testimony, that Hall admitted he was in Dallas, but said he was in the lobby of the Hilton Hotel in Dallas at the time of the assassination, and over 50 people saw him and would be able to testify to that. Lauren Hall, of course, denied this under oath, and stated that he was home, that he woke up that morning, drove his wife to work. John Pappas said his mom wasn't working at the time, which they did not know at that time. Hall says after getting home from taking his wife to work, he got up, he was taking a shower and shaving when the news came on that Kennedy had been killed. He had scheduled a lunch with someone at a hospital supply company where he was going to get a job. He wouldn't have that lunch, and so there's no way that, he was in Texas or could have been involved. Those witnesses were never called during the subpoena hearings for Lauren Hall. And later, a woman who he said he called, said that couldn't have been possible because she was at her sister's house that day. And the gentleman who he was potentially going to have say was going to hire him from the hospital supply company said, I could not be certain that I met with Lauren Hall on that day. Now, when you think about Ned, us growing up and people saying, where were you when Ronald Reagan was shot, or where were you when JFK was shot, I don't think people would forget who they were with that day or what they were doing. And so the chapter of that book concludes with me asking almost like a summary to a jury, would you indict Lauren Hall, not for the killing of the president, but for lying about, his testimony that he was in California and not in Dallas, Texas on that day. To me, it's obvious that he was in Dallas, Texas that day, and I was buttressed by the fact that John Pappas, looked me in the eye and said, I know where I was that day. I know where my mom was, and Skip was not with us.
So I think some people would be very disappointed if I didn't ask you this next question. Is there any possibility that Skip Hall was a shooter in the Kennedy assassination?
Is there a possibility? Since he was there, then I believe there was a possibility. And the fact that he returned home a couple weeks after the assassination and handed John Pappas a Mannlicher Carcano rifle and told him to put it away and never talk about it again. And when John said, what's this about? He said, you'll find out. And when John later said, what happened, Skip talked about the grassy knoll, and I have the exact quote in the book that Skip said to John Pappas, someone was there to flip the switch, and someone was there to make sure it got done. And the interesting thing about that Mannlicher Carcano rifle that John still possessed at the time of his passing and his family still holds is that it was a 7.35 millimeter, and the Carcano rifle attributed to Lee Harvey Oswald is a 6.5 millimeter Carcano. And interestingly enough, the tip of the bullets are different. There's a bull nose, for those that know the magic bullet, or CE, Case Exhibit 399, known as the magic bullet, has that rounded bull nose. Everybody kind of that's into the case knows about that copper bullet that magically doesn't seem to be that adulterated as you might expect for something passing through two human beings. But the 7.35 had a pointed tip. And there's a chapter in the book that goes into that. I don't want to take up too much time talking about it. But what's interesting is I have discovered since publishing the book a chain of events that explains the custody of Lauren Hall being in possession of a 7.35 millimeter Carcano rifle associated with the Kennedy assassination. And that stems around three people. One's name is Tracy Barnes. Tracy Barnes was a director at the CIA at the time of the Kennedy assassination. He survived the Kennedy culling of Allen Dulles and Richard Bissell, and of course the quote-unquote demotion of E. Howard Hunt after the Bay of Pigs. Tracy Barnes was still there, and there's a man named Robert Morrow. And Robert Morrow wrote several books. Some are part fictionalized, and therefore a lot of people have dismissed him. But Robert Morrow tells a specific story about Tracy Barnes contacting him in the summer of 1963 and directing him to purchase 4 7.35 Mannlicher Carcano rifles from a place called Sonny's Sporting Goods in Baltimore, Maryland. And think about the specificity of how Robert Morrow is telling this story. Robert Morrow then talks about taking 3 of those rifles because one he later learned was defective. And he was charged for making sure that those rifles could be broken down. By that, I mean that, the stock of the rifle and the barrel could be easily separated so that, in a sense, they could be folded or put next to each other to not look like a rifle and where you would have to have a rifle bag. Morrow also talks about a week later being contacted by Eladio Duvall, for people that know the Kennedy assassination will know that name, being asked to put together 4 transistor radios that would be close-range radios for communication that could not be deciphered outside of anybody not utilizing those radios, because Morrow had that experience. So just to take a step back, Robert Morrow, a lot of people discredit him, but at the same time, he factually was involved in the whole Castro-Cuba situation, and the fact that he was preparing counterfeit plates for Mario Colli, who was eventually busted. Colli may have very well been Castro's successor had Nixon been elected, but because Kennedy was elected, Colli was not only not in that position, and he was not a favorite of the Kennedy administration, but he eventually got convicted for this counterfeiting racket where they were going to put $6 million of fake pesos into the Cuban economy to destabilize, to fund bribing and Chloe's troops. I think they were only down to about 300 after the Bay of Pigs. That a lot of his people got slaughtered in the Bay of Pigs. But Chloe, the person who was helping with the counterfeiting, was Robert Morrow, and Morrow himself was arrested for that. And so Morrow clearly was involved with the CIA, and he talks about taking those 7.35 Mannlicher Carcano rifles to a private airstrip in Baltimore where a person flew to pick them up. He described that person as David Ferry. For those that know the Kennedy assassination about David Ferry, Joe Pesci played him in the movie JFK. He was a pilot, commercial pilot. And it's very interesting, Ned, that I'll be writing about this in very great detail. But Robert Morrow writes the name Lauren Hall in his book Betrayal, and he writes it under pseudonym, but he does a document called Betrayal 2 and actually names people. And how in the world John Pappas had no idea who Robert Morrow was. He had no idea about any of this that I'm talking about. John, as I said, just passed away at the age of 80. If he was in it for the money or a sensationalist, he could have done something with that rifle over the years or tried to make money off of it. He was a highly successful man, owned his own plane. He knew nothing about the Morrow story. and yet he's a young man who Skip Hall is coming home to and handing this 7.35 Mannlicher Carcano that he finally went public with in 2021 because all of the Kennedy files weren't released. And in my book, I talk about that the two Pappas brothers, now one approaching 80 and the other already in his 80s, said, gosh, Trump didn't release all of them, Biden didn't release all of them, we're going to at least get this story out about this rifle that we possess that we got from, that John got from Skip Hall. So you now have this story that has never been told. People are hearing it for the first time on your station, where I'm actually showing the chain of custody from an order from Tracy Barnes to Robert Morrow to purchase those rifles at Sunny Supply in Baltimore, get them transferred to New Orleans. There's another story about a highly, again, questionable individual named Thomas Beckham. And Thomas Beckham talks about taking the plans from New Orleans for the assassination to Hall's, one of Hall's contemporaries named Lawrence Howard, Larry Howard, Fat Larry, the Fat Mexican he was called. And Thomas Beckham, with the promise of immunity, it's one of the reasons why I think Jim Garrison was so confident before he died that the truth would actually be known about the Kennedy assassination. Thomas Beckham said that Lauren Hall and Larry Howard both had keys to the same church in New Orleans where they stored and supplied weapons and ammunition that they were transferring south of the border into Cuba. When you start wrapping this whole story together, and I can show this chain of custody of these rifles, it's a really intriguing story about how John Pappas ended up with that 7.35 Mannlicher Carcano. And the last two things I'd like to mention about this rather, I think, compelling bit of information is that there is a CIA report from the Italian Special Forces who reviewed the assassination of the president and returned information in that report that they believed that the weapon and the way that President Kennedy was assassinated was with a Carcano rifle, but with a 7.35 millimeter. And there is that document. I can send that to you, Ned, so that you can take a look at it. So it's just very, very interesting because you think about how stupid and silly it would be that if Lee Harvey Oswald was told or ordered that rifle from Klein's in Chicago, which in itself is suspect because there were over 17 locations right in the city of Dallas where he could have literally walked to buy a rifle, that there would need to be documentation for him buying a rifle through, the back of a magazine to Klein's Sporting Goods in Chicago, which I do believe Jerry Hemming, who I mentioned earlier, screwed up by putting on his application as a reference for his CIA application. He has John McCone's company that his uncles were involved in as a reference. And in Jerry Hemming's CIA application, he has Klein's Sporting Goods in Chicago as a reference. And when Alan Weberman confronted Jerry Hemming about it, it was one of the only times where Hemming completely lost his composure outside of his normal bloviating and using foul language to realize that, oh my gosh, I had actually put that on my application for the CIA. But think about how ludicrous it would be that if you were trying to match the weapon that was supposedly going to be said that was used in the assassination, that you wouldn't get the same caliber. Would it be sloppy enough to just say, go purchase Mannlicher Carcano rifles? Or they really are Carcano rifles. The cartridge is a Mannlicher that drops the bullets in through a cartridge. But it would seem really incongruent to try to pull off an assassination to say that only one shooter was involved. Why wouldn't they have used the same caliber rifle? Why was it 7.35 millimeters? And so that whole story is a story within itself that you and I could do 10 hours talking about, but I wanted to share that with you, that's new information that I've also learned since I wrote the book.
And I'm going to have just one very small follow-up to that, because, it seems like you're keeping an open possibility, but I don't think I got a direct answer from you, so I'm going to rephrase the question. Do you think Skip Hall was the shooter?
So I'm going to give you an unsatisfactory answer and say I don't know, and because I don't know, I have to default to no. But it probably is frustrating in the same reason why I said 0% as DB Cooper. The one thing that's very interesting about Skip Hall is very similar to other Cooper suspects, William Gossett Ted Braden, and of course even Lee Harvey Oswald himself. These were young men who tried to sneak into the military before they were 18 years of age, and they wanted to be in the military, and they seemed to fit a similar profile. And at the age of 15, Lauren Hall tried to get into the Army. His card says rejected for being underage. He went from a Newton address to a Wichita address and changed the spelling of his name from an A-N to E-N for Lauren at the end of it, and got rejected again for being underage. At age 17 in 1947, he got into the Army, but within a year, he had his first separation agreement from, of all places, Fort Lewis in Tacoma, Washington. So he had obviously been in Tacoma, Washington, but and it was believed for an epileptic seizure. It was the only one throughout his life that he was ever stated to have had. But at the bottom of that first military discharge from the Army, it says that he's excluded from further service in the military. So he comes back to Newton, Kansas, and he joins the Kansas National Guard. And also something that's new, and I'll be showing photographs of Lauren Hall for the first time at CooperCon. This is the first time I'm sharing it publicly. He served in law enforcement in Newton. So I actually have photographs of Lauren Hall in police uniform. These are directly from his family. They're not available online anywhere. And it was a very short time that he must have been in the military, because by 1949, he's back in the Army, which is really strange when you see that first separation notice and it says, that he's excluded from future service. What I learned, Ned, was that he was not just a marksman and a sharpshooter. He was an expert shot. And while Lauren Ann was left-hand dominant, smoked with his left hand, played golf from the left side, he was also ambidextrous. And there's pictures of him drinking, usually with his left hand, but also smoking left hand, drinking right hand. And what I learned is that Lauren Hall was not only an expert shot, but he was an expert shot from both sides, both hands. So when you think of someone in the old Westerns with the 6 shooters on both hips, pulling them up and hitting dimes, that was Lauren Hall. He had that ability, and I believe that's probably one of the reasons why he was allowed back into the Army. He went to Fort Knox in 1949 to serve there. Bourbon country, for those DB Cooper fans that know that DB Cooper drank a bourbon and 7-Up. He was in Louisville and served at Fort Knox. But he was one of 700 men chosen to then take off to post-World War II Germany at the Military Counterintelligence School in the Garmisch area in Oberammergau, Germany. And Hall, actually, in his testimony to the House Select Committee on Assassinations that I summarized in bullet points in my book, tells of his training in Germany, counterintelligence training. He became a military police officer. He did provost marshal investigating training. He continued, obviously, with his rifle and sharpshooting training. But he also was trained in demolitions and explosives, which obviously is interesting for the Cooper case, as we know, DB Cooper bringing a bomb and a briefcase on board. And he also did plainclothes investigations on the border of Belgium. And that means that he was assigned in post-World War II to make sure that contraband wasn't coming in illegally on either side of the border. And Lauren Hall tells a specific story to the members of the United States Congress in that House Select Committee on Assassinations about what I call being renditioned, where he was with a group that was shown slides of communist leaders talking about the need for potential elimination of these leaders in the future. And that does line up when you read about what was going on with the United States military in Germany in post-World War II. And, of course, General Edwin Walker, whose name is also associated with the Kennedy assassination, was a leader over there at that time. Frank Sturgis was over there at that time in Germany. So it's a very, very interesting topic regarding the Kennedy assassination. But that's the type of training that Lauren Hall had in the military when he was in Germany. And he said he was a corporal. His gravestone, or his grave site, the plaque on his grave that I visited last year, and actually put a flag by. No matter what I think of Lauren Hall's good and bad, I do appreciate his military service, and so I planted a flag there. And it says private on it, is his rank. Now, he did serve as captain when he returned in the Iowa National Guard after he got back from Germany in 1952 with his new wife and a baby on the way. And he was also served at a officer level for Camilo Cienfuegos in Cuba, which we haven't even got to, when he went down and after working in the Capri Casino for Santo Traficante in Cuba, people saw how great he was with weapons and cleaning weapons and utilizing weapons, and they said, hey, why don't you come help us out? And he ended up in the Escambray Mountains with Camilo Cienfuegos working for Che Guevara and Fidel Castro in the revolution that ended up with the Fulgencio Batista being removed from Cuba and Fidel Castro eventually taking over. Then having like that few handfuls of Americans that had helped Castro ended up being vehemently opposed to him, which led to much of the anti-Castro efforts, Interpen, that Hall was involved in those types of things. But that gives you just a background of Hall's military experience and his ability to shoot a rifle. I'm just not comfortable stating that he was a shooter. I will say it's odd when you have John Pappas look you in the eye and say, Skip said to me, someone was there to flip the switch and someone was there to make sure it was done. So do I believe Skip Hall was involved in the conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy? I absolutely do. Do I believe that he was a shooter? I'm not comfortable saying that.
Okay, and thank you so much for that. But I would like to know more about your book. And when you were looking into Skip Hall, at what point did you decide, oh, I have enough information for a book? And what was the research journey and process like?
Yeah, so going back to kind of when I said I was working, or I was really interested in what my friends Nikki, Chris, and Ryan were doing with Milton Vordal, who, by the way, you can find out all about Milton Vordal on Ryan's website, norjack.org, NORJAK, as well as all the witness FBI testimony. Everything is on that website. It's a wonderful website for anybody who, besides the Wikipedia page, wants to learn more about the DB Cooper case at norjack.org. And as I said, I was jotting down notes and pages became pages, but it got real when I had seen the article in the Tampa Bay Times in 2021 that was written by Paul Tash, the former chairman of the Tampa Bay Times, who now runs the Poynter Institute, or he's on the board of the Poynter Institute. He's retired, obviously, for ethics and journalism. And he wrote this kind of op-ed about these two brothers coming to him with this rifle and how they were getting it tested, and that they believed that they didn't like the word stepfather because they were adults by the time Skip had met their mother. It was both their second marriages. That they believed Skip was involved in the assassination and they wanted it on the record. And I had been looking at Hall as Cooper. So that really just flipped the switch, and I just started voraciously digging into Lauren Hall's potential involvement in the Kennedy assassination. I'd never done investigative journalism, and I was really nervous, Ned, but I picked up the phone and called Paul Tash, left a voicemail for him. He graciously called me back. He first called me back to verify who I was and hung up and then called back again. And we had a wonderful conversation for about 10 minutes. And he said, well, I don't know about the older brother, John, James, but I believe John might want to talk to you. And he hung up, and within an hour, our new administrative assistant at my office came in with this really sheepish look on her face, and she had just started with our company. And she said, yes, there's a man on the phone that says he wants to talk to you about the Kennedy assassination. So it was kind of humorous because I work in a IT cybersecurity company. And I talked with John over an hour right there on the phone and was just enamored with his story and hearing him talk about Skip. And, from there, the words just flowed, and I was writing. I think I first was introduced to John in October of 23, and I published the book at the end of February. So I just voraciously read, voraciously researched. And that's why I wrote the title with a question mark, because I knew I was kind of rushing in a way to get the book out. But I really wanted to ask the question, kind of, what do you guys think? My original intent was to maybe write 10 pages and post it on the Cooper Facebook groups and say, what do you guys think? But it really just kept going and going and going. And I was getting photos in, trying to contact other family members, had contacted one of his grandchildren. Unfortunately, it was a bad time with another member's health situation where they couldn't participate in the book. Now I have them participating, so I'll be following up with all those interviews as well too. But that's kind of the genesis of how I went from kind of joking around with finding bullet points about Skip Hall during the Vordahl investigation to within a year publishing that book in February of 2024.
And thank you so much for that. And John, as we wind down, I would really like to just give you the floor and give you a big opportunity to share any additional information about Skip Hall. Is there anything else you'd like to tell the listeners of Black Box Online Radio? Any additional DB Cooper info? Now, you can always tell us where people can get your book, Where Was Skip? But as Anna Garcia said recently, there are mostly two places where people get books these days, but you can also tell us anything about that. I'm going to give you the floor, and the mic is yours.
Yeah, I think I'll just, I've been pretty verbose, so I think I'll just kind of go through the bullet list here very quickly in a couple minutes. And, military experience I talked about, and I didn't talk about his parachuting experience, and that was one thing that was a big question at the time that the book came out. Well, great, he did all these things, but he wasn't a paratrooper, he didn't do those things. Well, what we learned is, and I put in the book, to join Interpen, you had to have a minimum of 5 jumps. Most people in Interpen were pilots as well, too, so that they could fly in an emergency situation. And we know that when Loren Hall married his second wife after he returned from Cuba, he got married for the second time in 1960. He got his student pilot certificate. His wife owned a Cessna 172 Skyhawk, which actually the Skyhawk version is IFR rated, which means that someone would know that they could pick up a flight plan in the air. But Skip Hall flew a Cessna 172, and his son Larry sat across from me and said, "Oh yeah, Dad flew that plane." So Skip Hall did have pilot experience. He was not a commercial pilot, but it's important to share that. I had photos of Skip Hall that I thought were at No Name Key, which is where Interpen trained. They were actually at Nellie Hamilton's boarding house, and a former Marine photographer named Tom Duncan took photos at this location. What I was able to learn is that that's the exact location where Interpen trained rigging and packing of parachutes. Jerry Hemming was a decorated parachute expert and ran Interpen along with a few others, and basically taught Cuban exiles and wayward soldiers of fortune who joined their group how to jump, how to parachute. I also learned that Hall later, around the time of the Cooper hijacking, was running an operation where they would have drugs brought into the United States. In fact, Hemming was arrested for large quantities of marijuana, where they trained parachutists to jump out of airplanes at night with packages of marijuana. And that'll be something new that I just learned in the last couple of months that I'm writing about that I'll be putting in the book as well, too. But it gives a real higher priority now to understanding that Loren Hall would have had at least that minimal experience packing and rigging parachutes and getting them prepared for their teams. And there's photos of him literally at the address where I now have proof that that was done. I talked about his demolitions and explosives experience. I don't need to go into that. We talked a little bit about his time in the mental hospital depression. He also was busted with Dexedrine a month before the Kennedy assassination. There's a police record on file from the Dallas Police Department that talks about him having barbiturates, amphetamines. When he is hospitalized for hepatitis at the beginning of 1968, before he goes to New Orleans to testify to Jim Garrison, famous author and Kennedy researcher Harold Weisberg is interviewing Hall, and Hall talks about them using Benzedrine and using it on missions. He obviously had the opportunity to travel at will. And then let's talk about his airplane knowledge. He worked for Cessna in Wichita. That's how he met his second wife. We know that he worked at Northrop in Hawthorne, California, where they had contracts to build the Boeing 747, and actually built the fuselage for the 747. And at the time, from 1968 through the early 70s, that Hall was working there when he wasn't laid off, that not only was he working on the Boeing 747 fuselage and the new flooring called Norfloor that Northrop had created that had a thin layer, 0.005 inches of titanium on it, which a bonded piece of typing paper is 0.004. So basically the thickness of a page of paper that they would put on top of the aluminum flooring on a 747 in the galleyways and where passengers walked to have strength without the weight, that he was a supervisor for that specific area. In that same building in Hawthorne, they were building the 2 cockpits for the SST, the supersonic jet. In that same building, they had a foundry that had lots of sand, and a foundry that they had built in the Hawthorne plant in the 1940s during World War II. And in that same building was their materials research lab with all of their engineers for Northrop. In 1966, they held a titanium symposium in Hawthorne, California at Northrop. People came from the Patel Metal Institute, Ohio, Pennsylvania. They all came to Hawthorne, California, maybe wearing clip-on ties, we don't know. But Hall certainly had that. So I also have a photo of him wearing a clip-on tie with an NAA tie-tack, North American Aviation. So when he first moved out to California, Ned, he put on, there's an FBI report that he self-reports as working for Cessna West for 10 months as a tool designer. So that specifically is on an FBI document. Then we have him wearing an NAA, a North American Aviation tie-tack. And then we know that he worked for Northrop, and I write about that in the book, and the Pappases went to Family Day at Northrop with Skip. So it's clear that he had that experience. I talked about the layoffs. He knew 2 Air America pilots. One was Howard K. Davis. So he had connections to knowing people that flew for Air America. We know that in 1968, when he flew to New Orleans to meet with Jim Garrison, that Skip Hall took a gun with him on the aircraft, that he wore a suit, and that he bought a ticket under the name Ray Crowler, Raycrowler. If you line that up with Dan Cooper, those are 2 very similar aliases. And so the real question is, was Loren Hall his own copycat? And when he flew to be interviewed by Jim Garrison in May of 1968, was he his own copycat when he did that, flying under the name Ray Crowler to New Orleans? After the hijacking, Loren Hall changed his appearance. He wore rose-colored glasses. He grew his hair out, basically kind of looked like a big bushy kind of afro look. And he started a foreign-named investment company called Aegean Investments. So the real question is, someone who was going through layoffs and potentially struggling with income, where would he have the money after 1971 to start a foreign investment company?
And that's what you think happened to the money?
I have a mugshot of Loren Hall as well, too, that hasn't been seen, that I'll be sharing for the first time. So I think that's a lot right there, Ned. I know I've been rambling on, but I've got a huge list here, but I guess I'll leave it there and say the rest will be coming in a new book and at CooperCon this year.
But to be clear, you think what happened to Cooper's money is that Lawrence Skip Hall allegedly would have used it for a foreign development business?
The only thing I know about Loren Hall is he, like other suspects that would have had connections to counterfeiting and money laundering, wouldn't have had an issue of either selling that money off for people to redo serial numbers on it, certainly taking it to foreign lands. But I think of people like himself, like Ted Braden, like others, where they would have had a higher potential to be able to quickly launder money that would never be found in circulation in the United States.
And I do greatly appreciate that. And John, one more time, thank you so much for appearing as a guest on Cooper Friday. And to all the listeners of Black Box Online Radio, John's book is called Where Was Skip?
Thanks, Ned. I appreciate the time.
And once again, I would like to thank John Limbach for appearing on Black Box Online Radio's Cooper Friday. And to be honest with you guys, I loved hearing about Skip Hall. I think that Skip Hall is a fascinating DB Cooper suspect. He's one of the stronger DB Cooper suspects, and he's also somebody who has so many stories that are connected to his life. And as you heard during the interview, we spent a large portion of this talking about the Kennedy assassination, where there is a type of connection. But I'm also going to be looking out for that new podcast that will be talking about Ted B. Braden, another fascinating DB Cooper suspect. And on Fridays, I also do something to conclude the episodes called the Cooper Profile, where I talk about the psychology of skyjacking, mostly going through the writings of Dr. David G. Hubbard, who was a pioneer in that field, and he wrote two major books called The Skyjacker and Winning Back the Sky that are all about how do skyjackers think, and specifically exploring the motivations that would drive somebody to commit a skyjacking. And I'm going to talk to you guys about that in just a second. But I have a couple of announcements here on Black Box Online Radio. The first is that I'm going to be doing more interviews for this channel, but I'm going to do them in a different format. In the past, it's been mostly just a sit down where I talk to a writer about their book or I talk to an investigator about their suspect, much as I did with John Limbach. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm sure I'll do more of those in the future. But I'm also hoping to have more true crime debates on this channel, where we actually discuss the facts of the case and we try to debate the issues. I've talked to Pat Bull, and she's agreed to do that for DB Cooper Friday here on Black Box Online Radio. And the new name of this segment will be the Cooper Hot Seat. And yes, every segment that I have here on Black Box Online Radio will be the hot seat, the Zodiac hot seat as well, where we're not necessarily going to be trash talking or getting angry, but genuinely trying to dispute the facts, genuinely trying to look at our disagreements and exploring the issues. So if there's anybody that you would like to see in the Cooper hot seat, please put your suggestion down below. And it doesn't only have to be me involved with the debate. I'm totally willing to moderate a debate between two other people, and in all reality, I'm looking forward to doing some of that. Now, in the future, we're going to make some very finely tuned rules. Things are still a little bit malleable, if you will, right now, but I definitely am looking forward to having some types of discussions where we really challenge the issues. And you can always just share any feedback you want and let me know what you think about all of this. Moving on to a different subject, I have another announcement for Black Box Online Radio, and that is that I am the author of a set of fiction called The White Horse Killer Saga. It is a series of stories that I started in 2020, and I release them in audiobook format here on YouTube 100% for free. The first was called Killer on a White Horse. The second was the Barry Albert tapes and Down the Dark Lane. Then there was White Horse Strong, and then The Eyes of the White Horse. And next weekend, I'm hoping to finally put out the final story. And that will be called The White Horse and the Sun. It will be the concluding segment to the White Horse Killer Saga. And yes, it's going to be done in a multi-episode style, but that will be coming out on the weekends for the summer and the fall. So lots of content here on Black Box Online Radio, and I know that is not the most popular segment for BBO Bar, but that is definitely something that I have a connection to, and once you start writing a story, you want to get to the end, and I've done 4 of them, right? And all of them had to end with a particular type of cliffhanger, and I finally wanted to write the story out in a way where we could reach its final destination. So please look out for The White Horse and the Sun coming out on the weekends in audiobook format. And the entire White Horse Killer Saga has been arranged in order in a playlist here on Black Box Online Radio. Now to move to the Cooper Profile segment, talking about the psychology of skyjackers. If you ever read the book The Skyjacker by Dr. David G. Hubbard, it is divided up into different stories and case studies, different examples of skyjackers. They are all either anonymous or there is only a first name that has been used. And the most recent one that I've went through is the story of Dan. He was one of the skyjackers who decided to go to Cuba, like many decided to do. But Dan has some differences compared to others. First, he's one of the few African-American skyjackers that is featured in the entirety of the studies, and he has some similarities compared to that of other people who chose to commit this type of crime. Now, if you have listened to the Cooper Profile in the past, perhaps you've heard me say that very frequently a skyjacker has an alcoholic father and a religious mother. And Dan has an alcoholic father and a religious mother, even to the point where he grew up really resenting his father because when he was with his father was always drinking. And then ultimately, the father walked out on the family and left them behind. And Dan had his education mostly at a Christian school where he was educated by nuns, and that is really the only description of the school that is provided in the book. But his mother was also heavily involved with the church. Now, a big difference between Dan's activities and most of the other skyjackers in the book is something that we don't talk about nearly enough on the Cooper Profile segment, and that is that he has an obsession with aviation. Some of the skyjackers do, like one of them was an avid skydiver, but Dan has mostly a childhood and teenage obsession with aviation. Specifically, he starts out by wanting to be an astronaut. He wants to be an astronaut as a kid and even into his adolescence, the way that a lot of kids want to be an astronaut. And in the mid 20th century, we had the space race. This stuff was talked about very frequently. But Dan was so passionate about this and so vocal about this that he even had the nickname Spaceman for a long period of time. But as he began to evaluate his potential career options, he decided that the Air Force would actually be a more suitable destination for him than trying to be an astronaut, so he wants to be an Air Force pilot. Then he also reevaluates and thinks, maybe that's not the best choice for me either. So Dan decides to join the Army. And he actually has a terrible experience. He went from being somebody who was just had this lifelong dream of being a pilot or maybe even flying a space shuttle to just having a terrible experience in the military. He doesn't like it at all. He doesn't like the Army. And he ultimately holds up a woman at knife point. Some exchange of words happen with a woman, and he just pulls a knife on her and threatens her. But he doesn't hurt her. And when he was interrogated about this, he stated that he had no real intention of hurting her. He just wanted to get out of the Army. But ultimately, he is discharged. And at the same time, he is also dealing with a lot of mental health issues that he has held back. Firstly, he hears voices and he can experience visual hallucinations. But it was really interesting that he noted that he only sees visual hallucinations at night. And I don't think that that is extremely shocking, because I've listened to a lot of radio Reddit, and when people who have psychotic disorders share their stories, they also talk about this. Like, they would experience the visual hallucinations only if they were looking at a dark wall late at night and so on. But even if it's just a room that's completely blacked out, then that's when they experience the hallucinations. But definitely the auditory ones would happen at any time of day. So he's dealing with lots of nervousness as well as these types of hallucinations, which maybe could indicate to me that Dan had some type of psychotic disorder. But what I think is more fascinating is he hid it from everybody during the Army. He hid it from doctors when he was examined and doing physicals. He might have been what we would call a high-functioning psychotic, and I'm not diagnosing anyone. I don't know if he actually would be classified under this disorder or that disorder, but it really makes you wonder about DB Cooper. I mean, was DB Cooper actually the cool, calm, and collected Cooper that we know, sipping his bourbon and soda with nerves of steel? Or was Cooper actually dealing with some very intense mental health issues? But I think that, if anything, what we can learn from Dan's story is that he wanted to do this because he just really wanted to take control of everything. And he's in Atlanta, Georgia. He gets a ride to the airport. He tells his family he's going to fly to California for a job, but that's all just a ruse. And he skyjacks the plane. He pulls out a .22 caliber pistol and he points it at a flight attendant, and he wants a passage to Cuba, the way that many people did. So ultimately, he gets to Cuba, but then he's apprehended, he's incarcerated, and when he's in Cuba, they have some issues with the legal authorities. They want to send him back to America, but Cuban-American relations were not very strong at the time. So ultimately, he's sent to Germany and then back to the United States. And Dr. David G. Hubbard was very keen to note in the book that he was watching a taped interview of him in the hospital. He didn't actually get to question him. So he's just telling this story on tape, and it's actually very, very casual, because one thing I left out was when Dan is experiencing his nervous breakdown, his mother experiences the same thing. Her son has been just dealing with all of these legal problems, kicked out of the Army, has a nervous breakdown, she has a nervous breakdown, and she ends up breaking a window in the church. As I said, she was very religious. So she gets arrested. The priest calls the police on her, and she's arrested. And then Dan is just like, yeah, I was going to kill somebody. I would have killed somebody if I could. If I had been out at the time, I would have killed someone if I had a gun and so on. And he's just saying this so casually. So this really goes to show that there's just a certain indifference that he has to following the law. I mean, maybe it's a result of his psychosis, but maybe it's also a result of something else. And this is the stuff that would be way more relevant to DB Cooper, because when Cooper's on the plane, he is breaking the law. He doesn't seem to care. He doesn't seem to mind. It just doesn't seem like it bothers him in any single way. He doesn't appear nervous. He's very polite. And when Dan talks about this, he says when he skyjacked the plane, he felt like he was in control. He just felt like he had power over all things. And somebody might be driven to something like this when they feel that they did not have to respect authority, when they felt like they did not have that father figure in their life to guide them, so they had to do everything themselves. They just had to take control of their own lives. Dan says all of this in the Skyjacker. So with somebody like DB Cooper, I really do think that this possibility of Cooper having a father who was not involved or just maybe completely absent would be very, very likely. Not 100% certifiable, but it's quite possible that Cooper did have an alcoholic father. It's possible that Cooper was not the oldest in his family. It's possible that Cooper did not develop a big respect of authority. Maybe he could fake it. I mean, Dan faked mental health, a clean bill of mental health for years, when he was dealing with what seems like a psychotic disorder. So, with DB Cooper, it really just appears that he could be somebody who had this giant gaping hole in his mind when it came to listening to authority. But another thing about Dan is just, I'm not completely sure about the consequences of his actions legally. As I said, he was incarcerated in Cuba, sent to Germany, and then sent back to the United States. But he just seemed so blasé about it, because he's like, oh yeah, I'm not really into aeronautics anymore. I'm more into medicine now. Oh, I met a girl while I was abroad, so that was nice. And he's just like, whatever, I don't care about anything. And I'm not quite sure if DB Cooper was there, because what we can expect about DB Cooper, according to me, is I think that there was some type of stressor in his life that would have driven him to commit this crime. I don't think that DB Cooper just thought of this on its own without any outside influence. I don't think that he thought of this just purely for fun, or purely for thrill, or even somebody like Barb Dayton who's doing this for revenge. I mean, yes, Cooper would have wanted the money, but why would he want the money? A particular type of stressor and guiding force. Well, let me know what you think about anything in this. What do you think about Cooper being able to hide certain mental health issues that he had? I mean, I'm really just asking that as a question, not as a declarative statement. I'm genuinely asking that because our Skyjacker example, Dan, was able to do so. Let me know what you think about anything. Thanks to John Limbach again for appearing on the program. And, if you want to support all of the efforts associated with Black Box Online Radio, then you can go over to buymeacoffee.com, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout-out on Zodiac Monday. And once again, please look out for the new DB Cooper Hot Seat, please look out for the audiobook for The White Horse and the Sun, and also all of the other programs and shorts and reels here on Black Box Online Radio. Thanks again, guys, and you have a wonderful weekend. Until next time.